So I'm excited to introduce our guest author, Samuel Skip Halpern. He earned his undergraduate degrees at Brown University in an interdisciplinary course spanning politics, philosophy, psychology, and modes of thought. He spent a year studying at London School of Economics. Then he graduated from the George Washington Law School in DC. His work life has revolved around protecting pension and health benefits for a wide range of workers, from Broadway stagehands to athletes in Major League Baseball, the National Hockey League, and the Association of Tennis Professionals, from steel workers and auto workers to Teamsters. He has advised U.S. government agencies, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and investment funds sponsored by China, Thailand, Brunei. I looked at this earlier, and I'm a reader. You'll know, you'll hear it. Sri Lanka, not to mention Inupiat and Eskimos above the Arctic Circle in Alaska. Now, you all already know this is going to be an amazing conversation, right? He continues working part-time today as an expert witness and advisor to the NHL Players Association. He's here to talk tonight about his book, Wellsprings of Work, Surprising Sources of Meaning and Motivation in Work. Many of his experiences take form in the book as engaging stories that help explore meaning, motivation, and values in our secular capitalist society. His thinking and the book are also influenced by his extensive travels from East Asia to India to North Africa and more. Skip is a local author. He and his wife, I think she's here tonight. There she is. We always like to give kudos to our wives of writers, live in Luray, Virginia, and are very involved in local politics and community action. Let's give a warm welcome to Skip.
Okay, yes, there it is. It is on. Thank you. Thank you all for coming out. Nice to see smiling faces from Page County and others.
And so you said you're retired, but when I read all of that, and I just really wonder what the definition of retirement is for you, Skip.
Well, staying engaged in various ways is the definition.
Okay, yeah. Very engaged. So let's just dive in and really look at why you wrote this book. What was it that came upon you that you decided, I need to write about work?
Well, the answer was when I semi-retired. I realized for several months there was something on my mind, and it was really gnawing at me. And it took me weeks, really months, to try to put my finger on precisely what it was. And it finally took form. It took a long time to really crystallize. And it was basically what motivated me in my work besides just earning a buck.
Yeah.
Why did I care about it? Why, despite the aggravations and the dead zones, did I overall find it very, very fulfilling? And framing the question was difficult enough. Answering it took a long time, but I started realizing that if I thought about it only abstractly, it didn't get me very far. So I ended up thinking about practical experiences. You could call them stories, episodes, and I drew on the experiences I knew best to see really what was going on beneath the surface. So I thought about my own career, and when I thought about particular episodes, I realized, whoa, that was what actually was going on in my mind, and I didn't fully appreciate it at the time. So ultimately, the book became a series of real-world stories about what motivates us, I'd say, in terms of purpose and values through the lens of work, even though, as you said, we're in a capitalist secular society which works against that kind of a search in many ways. And I started just thinking in terms of my own self. It was just strictly in terms of self-understanding that I started this. But then I got to the point where I thought I had latched on to some insights that may be helpful to other people, young, old, in between, and across many types of work, because I realized what was making me tick was not restricted to my particular career. I mean, my career in many ways would appear to be dry and technical and soulless or worse to many people. And I found that precisely because of that, those stories were especially effective vehicles for demonstrating that there's a whole lot going on beneath the surface, psychological, even spiritual drives that motivate people, whether you're a laborer or you're a lawyer or what. Many of the same, I think, impulses, albeit in many different forms, drive people all across the board. I'll give you one example of that. We've got a hot tub in our backyard, and the guy who oversaw pouring the concrete for the pad that it sits on, I realized after the concrete had dried, the hot tub was there. I noticed weeks later he had etched his initials, BHC, in a corner of the hot pad, the pad that the hot tub sits on. And I realized, because as a recovering lawyer, I had a number of cases which I had tried, and they ended up being in a reporter, a legal reporter. Court writes an opinion, it's recorded, people can look it up afterwards. And I realized the same impulse that led this guy to carve his initials in the concrete were an impulse that I had experienced, and it's literally leaving a mark, wanting to leave a legacy. You see the same thing with painters. They typically will write their initials in the bottom right corner of the painting, right? They literally want to leave a mark. And I think that's something that motivates all sorts of people, especially when they don't even realize it, although some of them do. And you mentioned Inupiat Eskimos. I'll mention one last thing. That was, the state of Alaska has a hell of a lot of oil, obviously, and they've got two big pools of investment funds. One the state runs, and that's the state permanent fund, but there is also a permanent fund that the Inupiat Eskimos in the very top slice of Alaska, we're talking within the Arctic Circle, we're about 900 miles north of Juneau. They've got a permanent fund. The state allows them to tax not the oil, but to tax the improvements on the surface, drills, for example, pipelines, that sort of thing. And they've got a permanent fund. And I went up there with my wife, Barbara, this is over 25 years ago at this point, and advised them their permanent fund is for when the oil runs out. They've got a permanent fund which is devoted towards the locals maintaining their culture, their language, their infrastructure, their social services, and it is called a permanent fund because it's very much oriented towards building for the future. And we can talk more about that, but I think building for the future is an enormous motivator for a lot of people, and they don't realize that that's really driving them.
Yeah, I definitely think we're going to talk more about that. I have to say the interdisciplinary background you have certainly came forth in the book, in all of the quotes and the philosophers, psychologists, all of these folks that you brought into this book. It's a commonplace book, by the way. That's the Robert Burns book.
Oh, you were
commonplace book. We talked about this earlier. But I guess what were the key figures who really influenced your writing here? Yeah. Because you could have gone direction of the Studs Terkel and things like that.
Yes. So. Well, Terkel was one of them. There are actually two that end in KL. One is Studs Terkel. The other is Viktor Frankl. Studs Terkel, as some of you might know, was a journalist out of Chicago, and he wrote a book, boy, that has sold a hell of a lot of copies, called Working. It's a real classic. It was written in the early 70s, I believe, and it had a big influence on me, and I really highly recommend it. For one reason, I highly recommend it because it's a really thick book, but it's in bite-sized pieces. So if you just want to get a taste, each one of the individual interviews does stand alone, and he interviews everybody from other journalists to stockbrokers to prostitutes to parking attendants to professional hockey players, and he's asking them, what motivated you? What made your job important to you, if it's important at all, or was it just a dead end? And that was very influential in my thinking. Viktor Frankl was a psychologist, an interesting, tragic story. He lost his wife and a lot of his family in the Holocaust, but in the concentration camps, he identified that for a person to have a purpose can be a very, very strong survival technique. And he developed a whole school of psychology called logotherapy. And that book had a big influence on me.
What's the title? Is that The Search for Meaning?
Man's Search for Meaning, yes. Probably at Stone Soup, I would think. You got it on the shelf. Another one was Arthur Koestler. Some of you might know of him. He was Hungarian. He was a playwright as well as wrote a lot of nonfiction, and very creative guy. And he identified, he wrote a very thoughtful book called The Act of Creation, about creativity. And one of the phenomena that he points to really struck me and might strike a chord with a lot of you. He talks about this really paradoxical sentiment that you can feel, where at once you can be very proud and simultaneously very humble. And he talks, the best way, the bumper sticker for this is he talks about, say, a scientist. Imagine a scientist who makes a really insightful discovery, whatever the field is, biology, physics, astronomy. The scientist will simultaneously feel very proud. I discovered this. And humble, a discovery has been made. Another part of the universe has been revealed. And that's a very transcendent feeling, even while your ego is gratified too, because I discovered it. And that, I think, goes on in a lot of different types of work and a lot of experiences beyond work. I mean, I think I define work very broadly in this book, so it's not just paid compensation. It can be work where you're poorly compensated or not at all. You can be a volunteer. You can have a very serious hobby. It's basically engaging yourself, applying yourself diligently to whatever you pursue. And I'll mention one other philosopher named Avishai Margalit. He's Israeli, and he actually has dealt very frustrating, I'm sure, trying to work out a peace arrangement between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But in any event, a very practical philosopher. And he has a lot of very, very interesting ideas about mortality and how concerns about mortality can operate beneath the surface also.
You kind of took a approach that was very positive, though, in a way of looking at work. And I wondered, compared to, I think Studs Terkel who said 40% of Americans are working in unfilled jobs that are crappy. I'm not going to use the word.
Well, I will. Call a spade a spade. There was a book written by a guy named David Graeber, very clever guy, British anthropologist. And the title was one of the best things about the book, but there was a lot to commend it. The title was Bullshit Jobs. And he was bemoaning the percentage of people in the Western world, not just the United States, but Western Europe, who work at what he defines as bullshit jobs, meaning the person, the worker himself or herself, feels like this is pointless, it's meaningless, it's soul-crushing. And I thought that he went overboard, because I thought he talked about a lot of work and a lot of workers, which to him might be bullshit, to use his phrase. I'd never use those words.
I said crappy.
You did. You did. Come on, MK.
NPR.
Put it out there.
Right?
But in any event, I thought there needed to be a rejoinder to that because I think he overplayed his hand. And I think I don't know if I mentioned Abraham Maslow, another. Maslow was, in my mind, and this is still the same point, Maslow was kind of a rejoinder to Freud. Freud looked at all the dark emotions, all the pathologies and neuroses. Maslow, later, an American in the mid-1900s mostly, had a much more uplifting view, and he talked about a hierarchy of needs. Some of you might be familiar with that, and the notion of self-actualization. And he said, famously in my mind, he said, if you want to study how fast human beings can run, for example, you don't take the average person on the street. You look at the Olympians, the gold standard. And why don't, so it was a very positive, affirmative kind of view. And I think there was a Maslow approach to this subject because a lot of people get a hell of a lot out of their work. There's 40%, if you're going to do the empirical study, there's 40% who are very positive about their work. And there was a conference board study just last spring, I believe, that had the figure way above that amongst Americans in particular. Like 65% really felt like they had great jobs.
So what are your book breaks down into sort of primary motivations for, or values, really at crafting fulfilling work. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about a few of those? I know that's a big question because there's a lot of things that you talk about.
Well, I'll give you one example, and I think it's a good example because it touches on several types of impulses that I get into in much more detail with later stories deeper in the book. Once upon a time, there was an automobile company, you probably have heard of it, Ford Motor, and they had a collective bargaining agreement with the United Auto Workers. And guess what? The company had one interpretation of what the collective bargaining agreement meant, and the union had a different one, specifically shocking. Specifically on the subject of retiree medical. The union took the position the company had agreed to fund retiree medical benefits for retirees for the rest of their lives. The company's position was, no, we agreed to fund retiree medical during the term of the collective bargaining agreement. So as the lawyers say, litigation ensued. They finally kissed and made up, and the settlement agreement provided that Ford would contribute a certain type of equity security, it's called a warrant, to a medical fund, and then whatever value, whatever money was able to be generated from the sale of those warrants, Ford was out. That was it. And I subsequently dealt with one of the UAW lawyers who called the warrants snow for the Eskimos. And the reason he called them that was because the way a warrant works is it's like an option, and its value is tied to the value of the common stock. Well, the value of those warrants would be basically zero until the value of Ford hit $9.20. That's the so-called strike price. When Ford gave these warrants to the medical trust fund, Ford was trading at about $2. So it was snow for the Eskimos. It's wallpaper. And then guess what? We were appointed to be in charge of selling these warrants if they ever went, what they say, in the money. And then the stock, of course, went from like 2 to 4 to 6 to 8. Pretty soon, it was looking like they might actually be worth something. They hit 9, they hit 920, and then they went to the moon. It went much over 920. And that effectively meant the medical trust could sell these to anybody who would want the stock to take on a value above the strike price, and all they'd have to do is effectively pay $9.20 if the stock was actually trading at, say, $11.50 or $12. Well, eventually we were able, and it was a big job, and we amazingly succeeded at it. We raised $1.8 billion. That's B as in beer. That's B as in books and brews. For the retirees. And so it was a grand slam home run. And as I thought about that, I was really struck with how I felt during that experience. And there were several things. One was, there was a David and Goliath thing going on, because we were just my firm was small, it was like 35 people, but just 4 of us working on this basically against Ford Motor Company. So there was play and there was competition going on, and one chapter in the book goes deeply into that subject. Another thing that was going on was this pride and humility thing that I mentioned a minute ago, because I was very proud that this went so well, but I have to say, I was overwhelmed by how enormous this thing was, and I felt like a little speck of sand on the beach compared to all the moving parts and all the different players and the number of retirees. We were talking 200,000 people, 200,000 retirees and their families. And another part of it was just the teamwork. You know, there's an esprit de corps, and I'm sure people all experience some version of that in different situations. And then the final point, maybe it's the most flagrantly obvious point, was I really liked the way what I favor politically and socially aligned so well with the assignment. It was really gratifying to do something that I thought was really so socially useful to so many people. And later chapters go into each one of those motivations more fully, so that's kind of an overview.
How about fear?
Oh, yeah, I actually mentioned this in the book. When I was a young pup and I was still lawyering, my very first trial, my boss pulled me into his office, and I thought he was going to give me some sage advice. And he did give me advice, but it wasn't so sage. His advice was, don't screw up. And fear was definitely a motivation here, because under this federal law that regulates pension and health funds, you're personally liable if you are found in a court of law to be negligent or corrupt. So you really have to be, as they say, what was it, Hill Street Blues, be careful out there.
Yeah, there's stake in the game.
Yes.
The Warren Buffett, I just want to throw that out as another story. There's so many great stories in here. And I want to say, I'm so appreciative. My father was a financial major.
Oh,
finance.
Really? Yeah.
I was not. And I loved the layperson's breakdown of what you did. I understood it.
Yeah,
I was so
good.
excited.
Good.
So it was really, I appreciate that.
Well, maybe you can explain it to me.
But probably not. But I love the Warren Buffett comment of, he was on your voicemail for a year?
Oh,
Is
yeah.
that right?
Yeah, this was another, for any of you who have dealt with the Rust Belt in the United States, all the failed auto companies, steel companies, auto supply companies, it's really tragic. And the Steelworkers Union probably felt the brunt of it as much as anybody. Some of you may be familiar with a company called Kaiser Aluminum. And Kaiser is a very specialty steel and aluminum producer. Went into bankruptcy in 2002. They had also agreed, and there was no dispute over this, to pay retiree medical for the life of their steelworker retirees. But in bankruptcy, guess what? They couldn't honor that. So to come out of bankruptcy, they made a deal, and the deal was, once we come back out and we're publicly traded again, we will devote, I remember the number precisely, 57.6% of our publicly traded stock to a retiree medical fund for you retired steelworkers. And my firm was appointed as the party in charge of selling that stock over a period of years. And it was only maybe 6 months into managing this fund that I get a call from Warren Buffett. Are you kidding me? Me? And I had a number of occasions where it was Warren on one end of the line and me on the other end of the line. And he was very folksy, very straightforward, crystal clear, very pleasant. I want to buy all of that stock for X dollars. And one day I came back into the office and there was a message on my machine along the lines of, "Hi Skip, this is Warren. It's 1:15 your time. Please give me a call." And I saved that on my message machine for a year. I am embarrassed to say.
What was your motivation for
Well,
that?
I thought a lot about that question. And it's one great example of why I thought pondering what motivated me in concrete examples was so much better than just thinking in abstract terms. And it really took me a while to noodle through, that's so embarrassing. Why did I leave that on my phone? Why did I think that was so cool? And I realized, and getting to Studs Terkel in a minute, I realized it was because I was getting respect and I was getting recognition. I mean, here's this titan calling me. Wow, that's respect with a capital R. That doesn't even start with a B. And when I read one segment, one interview in the Studs Terkel book, it was an interview of a waitress. And it's very short, it's like 2 or 3 pages, and the waitress is talking about why she takes pride in her job, and she refers to one particular incident where there was some guy who gave her a hard time and said, "Honey, you don't need to smile at me, I'll still give you a tip." And she refused to be demeaned by it. She said, "I'm not smiling at you for a tip. I'm smiling at you because I want to do the job right." And she had self-respect. She wasn't getting any from this customer, but it was basically the same motivation, albeit in a radically different form. It was the same common human drive, I think, that motivated her, and that really struck me.
You also talk about, and I think we're going to get to these drives throughout this conversation, and I'm supposed to get to you all too. So, but I have to go to the dark side a little bit, because it all has that, blooming cherry trees in March kind of underbelly feeling of why. But that work that you say here, or I don't know whether you're quoting somebody, underpaying someone for good work is an insult, and paying fairly is a sign of respect.
Yes.
And what about those fields where we have incredibly undervalued, underpaid people in lots of different fields, from teaching to book selling to writing to food service and farming?
Yeah, no, it's really true. And I think, well, several things. One is underpaying is a sign of disrespect. And I think the person who's underpaid really struggles not to feel otherwise. And I think maybe the classic case, still in 2024, clearly etched in everybody's memory, is the way we praised essential workers during the depths of the COVID pandemic. Whether it's sanitation workers or clerks at a grocery store, or cops, firefighters. And I mention in the book that, that's great to recognize the value of essential workers. But if I was an essential worker and all I got was the lip service, and then the day later my pay hasn't gone up, that would be really aggravating, because it would be so hypocritical. There's a phrase that the AFL-CIO has used over the years: a fair day's wage for a fair day's labor. The Soviet Union, for those who remember it, had a variation of that. We pretend to work, you pretend to pay us. And so, there's disrespect on both ends of that telescope. And so I think the notion of fair pay for fair work is really important to this question of respect and self-respect and holding together a whole society, really.
Well, and just on that trend, that non-essential worker who is paid well, but who stayed home and they're not essential.
Yeah.
That had to reset so many of us in what we thought of our value for our work and whether we were essential to maybe in our home, but maybe not to society. So you talk about trends that have really kind of maybe reset how we look at work. And generationally, we've got different ways in which we look at the work, but what kind of trends do you see that are shaping our workers today?
Well, I'd say the most screamingly obvious example would probably be remote work. And there are many people, just to be clear, who are not affected by that at all because they've got to be on the site, whatever they're doing. They're manufacturing, they're farming, they're sweeping the streets, whatever it is. But still, there is a large segment of people who are very affected by remote work. And one question that I mentioned, that I explore a bit in the book, is how many of these human impulses that I talk about elsewhere can still survive or even thrive if you're not hanging out with your colleagues at the proverbial water cooler. And I think some of them do very much survive and remain very much intact, but some of them don't.
And they need a little bit of light, I think, as we shift into these new ways. I'm going to open it up because I've gone further than I usually do to questions from you all, because this is truly a conversation. I see somebody right here. Yeah. The question being, how does AI affect the potential of being a replacement to ourselves and still provide us, how do we find meaning in that?
Yeah. I am not a futurist, and I touch on an answer to that question, but I'm not competent to fully build that out. Having said that, I think there are actually some background forces leading up to the present day with AI's impact in particular. And one trend that I get into, sort of the larger backdrop, which has culminated in the AI phenomenon, is what I call scientism. And scientism, there's a whole huge literature on this, but it's basically an analysis of the impact of scientific thinking as the predominant way of thinking throughout the Western world and certainly in the United States. And I mean, you stop and think about that. It's material, it's not spiritual. Scientific thinking is material, and it's devoid of purpose. So if you're looking for purpose, you do not talk to a scientist, any of the sciences. And so consequently, there's this larger backdrop to, I think, living in the present day based on scientific thinking, which, don't get me wrong, I mean, science delivers amazing things, positive things, but at its core, there are some suppositions about the nature of the world, nature of reality, and nature or reality of values and anything that's spiritual. And I think that's even more of a root problem than the AI. There's a guy, Francis Crick, who was one of the co-discoverers of DNA, and I mentioned him in the book. You know, his view, and he's not alone, is basically everybody in this room ultimately is just a bunch of material molecules and chemicals flowing around, and whatever you feel and whatever you hope and whatever you aspire to or whatever you find as purpose or values, it's all a mirage. You're just a bunch of chemicals. And that sounds very, very extreme, but if you read the brief quote of his, I'm not exaggerating, And that is very pervasive, and it's very insidious, I think, the way it takes form in present day thinking. And AI is maybe the furthest iteration of that. The last thing I will say is there's a phrase which many people have probably heard, protect workers, not just jobs. And so part of the answer, whatever the impact of AI, and let's assume that it's going to be very damaging and difficult, there are a lot of politics aimed at trying to protect workers who suffer from that, whether it's job training, social support, economic support, whatever.
What would you advise a young person who's looking at our resource depletion, our changing world, and trying to determine how to find meaning in the system that we currently have?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I actually address that in an entire chapter in the book. I think it's called something clever like Building for the Future. And the Inupiat Eskimos and the Permanent Fund is one example, but there's another example which is probably even more to the point because it's so environmentally or ecologically oriented. There is a U.S. territory, I think it's 4,000 miles west of Hawaii. It's so far west, it's east, the Northern Mariana Islands. And the Marianas have, and this is why I dealt with them in a certain respect, they have the NMI, Northern Mariana Islands Pension Fund. And that pension fund had the dubious distinction of becoming literally the first public pension fund to declare bankruptcy. But when I ran into them, they were worried not about their pension fund being underwater, they were worried about their islands being underwater. And that's point one. Link that with Al Gore. The question is, after you almost win the presidency, but you don't, what do you do for a living? Well, he became a high-level marketing guy for a big money manager based on the West Coast called Metropolitan West. And Met West managed bonds for the Northern Mariana Islands Pension Fund. And they put Al Gore on the road to try to wine and dine clients and would-be clients and advisors to would-be clients. They had dinners at various cities, and I went to a dinner with about 8 or 9 representatives from the Northern Mariana Islands who already employed his firm, and I at a table. And the whole discussion that night was not about pension funds or bankruptcy or politics. It was about going underwater and climate change. And I use that as one example for this notion that I think, particularly for young people, but not only, building for the future is a really powerful motivation. And I think people can get a lot of value, personal gratification about building for the future. And that motivation can take many forms. You could be a journalist, you could be an oceanographer, you could be a politician, be an environmental lawyer, biochemist, you name it. But I think building for the future is a very powerful drive for, especially for younger people, but not only. And the last thing I'll say on that was there is a philosophy professor at NYU, a guy named Samuel Scheffler, and he threw out an imaginary scenario, and then the movie, what was it called? Don't Look Up, Leonardo DiCaprio, Kate Winslet, came out subsequently. And the scenario is the world is about to be hit by a terribly destructive, game-ending asteroid in 30 days. And Scheffler writes a brief essay. What would that do to your frame of mind and your motivation, regardless of what type of work you do? You're a cancer researcher. You're building a bridge. You're an engineer building a bridge. Whatever, the world is going to end in 30 days. you would lose almost all motivation. The future without a future. And there was a very cute way that, as I recall, he put it at the end of this essay. He said, in Streetcar Named Desire, the character Blanche Dubois depends on the kindness of strangers. And Scheffler wrote, I don't depend on the kindness of strangers, but we all depend on the future existence of strangers. And it's really true. Almost everything implies that you're doing something that has an impact into the future.
Well, one of your other motivations was also legacy. Mm-hmm. And how do those two really, how are they different?
Yeah, I'd say they're really different. The saying, if you're a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So when I was working on this book, I'd just read the newspaper or a magazine and I'd see stuff and I'd say, yeah, that fits my framework, or that fits my framework. 5 years before, I wouldn't have thought it fits any framework at all. It's just another random piece of news. And I read a quote by the former governor of California, Jerry Brown. And he was really pushing this cap and trade, speaking again to the ecological, environmental problems. He really pushed the California legislature to pass a carbon cap and trade program. And he said something along the lines of, this isn't for me. I won't even be around when the real problems hit the fan. This is for you, and it's damn real. And so he was, again, looking to the future. And I distinguish that from legacy, because I think legacy is much more egotistically driven. I think it's much more, I want to leave a mark, like I said at the very outset. The biggest, I mentioned in the book, some of the world's biggest philanthropists, or at least United States philanthropists, always stick their name at the beginning of their foundation. But love them or hate them, one thing about George Soros that really struck me is he doesn't call his foundation the Soros Foundation. He calls it the Open Society Foundation. And it's because he apparently is very driven by his ideas and his ideals, as opposed to having his name on the wall, which I thought was very exemplary. And legacy, also, I'm a tennis fan, and I read one account of an Argentinian tennis player, Guillermo Vilas, if any of you are tennis geeks. And he said, when you're a professional tennis player, you want to win one tournament. Then you want to win a second tournament. And after the third tournament, you want them to build a statue of you downtown in Buenos Aires. That's legacy. That's very egotistical. It's not, it's a cap and trade program and it's important after I'm long gone. That's me. And so it's very different, I think. Well, I think we need to get you drinking more beer.
More
so
beer.
You have some questions.
I that's right. I do have a question about the transcendence, in the sense of it's a very secular, you're looking at it from a perspective, but you elevate this into a motivation that goes beyond all of this legacy and building for the future into something that transcends. And I guess, what are the different ways that you see that working can transcend?
Yeah, I thought of several aspects of transcendence. It's one of the sections of the book with multiple chapters, and maybe the most obvious part of it is any kind of work that makes you feel connected to something beyond yourself. Could be an idea, could be a movement, like a political movement. There were a few examples. I mentioned earlier this philosopher, Avishai Margalit. He talks about transcendence in a really unusual way. He talks about people who recognize that they probably will not be remembered for what they did as individuals, but they will be remembered as being part of some collective which is recognized into the future. And his classic case is a New York City firefighter who, as an individual, might be an unknown to scads of people, but feels connected to a department which will be remembered and gets a lot of gratification out of being part of that collectivity. And that's one form of transcendence. Another form that I talk about grows out of some experiences I had in China. And, you know, their demographics, it's upside down. Everybody's old. And so the young people, there aren't enough young people because of their one-child policy, very recently amended. They don't have enough young workers coming into the system to support pensions for the literally hundreds of millions of Chinese who are elderly. The pyramid is exactly upside down. And I dealt with them on that subject of their retirement system, and made some recommendations that they astonishingly actually adopted. But I felt that sense of transcendence because I was dealing with such an enormous population and such an enormous country that I did feel, in a certain way, being connected to something much larger. I mean, that's not the most spiritual form of it, but it is a form of it, and it was significant.
It certainly is inspiring. I think, you know, whether, as you said, the young who are looking at where they're going to enter into the workforce, these ideas of how do I do work that is more fulfilling. And do you feel like the younger generation, I hear, they don't want to work? So y'all answer back. Yes.
I actually,
you know, but
yeah.
you hear that, and the idea of what are they asking for? What kind of work are they looking for?
Yeah, that has caught my eye. I remember about maybe a year ago, it was after I finished writing this, I saw a long article called Anti-Ambition. And it was a long article. I think maybe it was in the New York Times magazine. And it was talking about how kids these days, you know, one of those, they don't have any ambition. They don't want to work. They just want to collect a paycheck, sit back, drink beer, whatever. And there was a guy, I tend to look at comments, readers' comments on occasion. And this one was listed, I think, by the number of viewers who looked at the comments. And the one comment that got the most views was from a guy, I still remember this because I made a mental note of it, some guy from Berlin named Sebastian. And Sebastian got something like 2,200 views on his comment. And his comment was, young people today are not less ambitious. They are more ambitious, seeking meaningful work. And you can see this in about the last place you would expect to see it, but look it up if you don't believe me. There are a number of business schools, you know, the bastions of capitalism, that now are including elective coursework on finding meaning in your job and what personal values matter to you and how can you align your work with those values. Harvard Business School, University of Chicago, NYU, Seton Hall, Stanford, they all have coursework now on this for business majors and MBAs. And that's I find that a really, really healthy development. Yeah.
So for those who are not getting meaningful, do you have thoughts, ideas on how to make lemonade or how to move on? Yeah,
I think there are basically two answers. The first answer is reality. There are, you know, I'd say in the book, Amazon calls its warehouses a fulfillment center, but they don't call it that because the workers are fulfilled. That's the fact. There are a lot of dead-end jobs out there, jobs that are just soul-crushing, And, if you want to completely delude yourself, somehow maybe you'll manage to find something there. I think it was Martin Luther King who said, if you're a street sweeper, sweep the streets like Beethoven wrote symphonies and Michelangelo painted. Well, I get the sentiment, but I think that's overstating the case, frankly. There was also an incident, some of you might know of this, apparently when he was president, JFK went to, I think it was the Johnson Space Center down around Houston, and he was talking with a janitor, and he asked the janitor, tell me about your job. And the janitor said, I'm helping to put a man on the moon. Whether it's apocryphal or true, I don't know, but it's the same kind of thing, trying to make lemonade out of lemons. I think the other approach is perhaps a little bit more realistic, and that is to try to see whether any of what I call these wellsprings, which are not obvious on the surface, might actually be going on this job, which might appear dry or technical. There can be so much going on beneath that really is genuine and really is redemptive. And if it's possible to latch on to any of these ideas and any of them strike a chord, that can be very fulfilling and helpful, I think. But if it ain't there, it ain't there.
Do you want to leave us with anything specific tonight?
I guess one thing that I would leave as sort of shorthand, as I've come to think of it, is what you do for work is only part of the story. Whether what you do is able to tap into one of these underlying sources of meaning or motivation is at least equally important. And I think if you can identify and understand what they are, it can help you figure out whether they are actually working and whether you can, in fact, tap into them. Another takeaway in my mind, and I find this really has a lot of political implications to me, is this notion that the same motivation might be driving people who are ostensibly in such totally different occupations, and yet they share a common kind of sentiment or underlying impulse. I mean, think, Warren Buffett and the waitress, that one. I mean, I think that's really not overblown. I think that's accurate. I think it really works like that. And it's a great, they talk about the diploma divide in terms of some of the divisions in this country. And I think one way to think about that is you got a diploma, you don't have a diploma, but you might be plugging into the same kind of underlying psychology or spirituality, even if the jobs appear very, very different. So I guess I'd leave it there.
Hopeful wellspring for us to kind of rest in. Thank you so much for writing the book. Thank you, Pale Fire, Baines Group, WMRA. Get your book. Thank you for being a part of this.